Summer 1985, Allenstown, New Hampshire. Jesse Morgan, 11 years old, plays with his friends in Bear Brook State Park, a national park just bordering the mobile home community where he and his family live. Bear Brook State Park covers 10,000 acres and is one of New Hampshire's largest state parks, taking up half the area of Allenstown. Jesse and his friends come up with a game. They'll play hide and seek with the seeker riding on a four-wheeler. The friends played all summer long. One day, in the middle of the game, something strange happens. One of Jesse's friends, Keith, finds a barrel in the woods. A blue 55-gallon steel drum. The lid is not sealed, and peeking out of the top is a plastic bag. The kids examine the barrel and try to pull the lid off. Immediately, the smell of rot fills their noses. They kick the barrel over and decide to leave. Had they looked inside, what they would have found would have ruined their innocence. 2 bodies, decomposing and dismembered. But, perhaps thankfully, they did not look inside. Instead, the kids leave. And with that, months would pass, with the barrels collecting dust and leaves. It wouldn't be until the fall that the barrel and its contents were discovered once again. The resulting investigation would take 30 years to reach any type of conclusion, and would lead to a forensic breakthrough in solving cold cases that still has lasting implications to this day. This is the true story of the bodies in barrels, the Bear Brook murders. Welcome to today's video. Information was sourced from the fantastic investigative podcast Bear Brook, as well as reporting by ABC News and various local news outlets. If you wish to do a deep dive into the story for yourself, I cannot recommend enough the Bear Brook podcast. With that being said, hope you are all safe, and thank you for riding the crime wave. Let's begin. November 10th, 1985. A hunter walking through Bear Brook State Park stumbles once again on the barrel. This time, the individual decides to look inside. He then immediately calls the police. Officer Roundmont Pleasure, a 23-year veteran of the Allenstown police force, arrives on scene. The hunter is pale white and tells the officer about his discovery. Officer Mount Pleasure walks through the bush and arrives at the barrel. He pries open the lid. A face, wrapped in plastic, stares back at him. New Hampshire State Police are called in and will take lead on the investigation. They discover that the barrel contains 2 bodies, one of a young woman, the other a little girl. The woman was estimated to be between 23 and 33 years old, the girl between ages 8 and 10. The remains were almost entirely skeletal, nude, dismembered, wrapped in plastic, and tied together with electrical wire. An examination of their skulls would reveal their cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head. Based on the level of decomposition, investigators determined that their bodies had been in the barrel from anywhere between several months to several years. Despite an intensive investigation, this would be the only information that investigators were able to glean. Most murder investigations start with police analyzing the lives of their victims. But in the Bear Brook case, authorities didn't even know who their victims were. And so, investigators decide to work under the assumption that the victims were a mother and daughter. They combed through missing persons reports and FBI records, hoping to find a document that would correlate to their victims. Their efforts, however, come up empty. Whoever these people were, it seemed that no one was looking for them. Months passed by. Investigators checked records for every elementary school in the state, looking for matches to the child victim, but this too provided no lead. The authorities then turned to camping records for Bear Brook State Park, combing through 5 years of records. Once again, they found no corresponding information. In 1986, several months later, composite sketches of the victims were made, the artist using the bone structure of the victims' skulls to get an approximation of their faces. When the sketches were released to the public, calls began to come in to the department, but even they amounted to no leads. In 1987, less than 2 years after the victims were found, state police decided to release the victims' bodies so they could be buried. The community of St. John the Baptist Church in Allenstown pooled their funds together to give the victims a proper burial on their cemetery plot. A small group of community members and journalists attended the ceremony. Their headstone, donated by the community, reads, "Here lies the mortal remains known only to God of a woman aged 23 to 33 and a girl aged 8 to 10. Their slain bodies were found on November 10th, 1985 in Bear Brook State Park. May their souls find peace in God's loving care." Unfortunately, with no leads to go on, the case goes cold. and is filed away among the dozens of other unsolved homicides in the state's history. Months would then turn to years. 15 years would pass without any developments in the case. That would change on May 9th in the year 2000. John Cody is the detective in the state police's major crime unit, which covers most of the homicides in the state of New Hampshire. Cody was assigned the Bear Brook cold case to work on in his spare time, and as he begins to comb through the investigation notes, the details of the case begin to gnaw at him. And so, he decides to go check out the discovery site for himself. Despite the decade and a half that had passed, what he discovers there is shocking. Just 300 feet away from the initial crime scene, John Cody discovers another 55-gallon barrel. In shock, he looks inside and can't believe what he finds. 2 more bodies lay in the barrel. They had been there, 100 yards away, all this time. Once again, New Hampshire State Police arrive on scene at Bear Brook State Park. An odd sense of deja vu washes over them. Officials examined the remains and determined that the 2 additional victims are also young girls. One was about 3 years old and the other 2 years old. Like the other victims, they were killed by blunt force trauma to the head. A decade and a half has passed, and now there are 4 victims in the Bear Brook case. The adult victim in her late 20s, the eldest child between 8 and 10 years old, 3 years old for the middle child, and 2 years old for the youngest. The adult and eldest child were found in the first barrel, the 2 youngest now found in the second barrel. DNA testing was conducted on all of the remains and showed that the adult female was maternally related to the eldest and youngest child. Investigators determined that she is most likely their mother. DNA tests would show no familial relationship for the middle child, causing investigators to speculate that she could be a stepchild or even an adopted child. And so, State Trooper John Cody and his colleagues in the investigative team went through every piece of information regarding the case. They hoped that this second barrel would be the key to cracking the investigation, that one of the second victims would be matched to a missing persons report. Unfortunately, history has a way of repeating itself. Investigators in 2000 combed through the same information that the investigators in 1985 had and came to the same result. Nothing. A dead end. It was almost like the case was moving backwards. In 1985, there were 2 bodies in a barrel and no leads. 15 years later, there were 4 bodies, 2 barrels, and still no leads. The case, once again, goes cold. Shockingly, for another 15 years. In 2015, forensic techniques had advanced enough to breathe new life into the case. Radioisotope testing was conducted on the bones and the hair of the victims. This technique can offer details about human life based on the type of environment that the person lived in. Using this information, scientists can provide an approximate location of where a person spent a significant portion of their lives. George Kavanaugh, a geologist with the University of Florida, analyzed the remains of the victims and was able to create this map in regards to the 4 Bear Brook victims. Testing of their hair showed that all 4 victims were together for the last 2 weeks to 3 months of their lives, most likely in the New England area. It wasn't much to go on, but at least, for the first time, investigators had something. Updated police sketches were also created for all 4 victims, with the investigators desperately hoping to now discover their identities. And to their relief, a break in the case would occur. But to understand how, we must turn back the clock 30 years, back to 1986, to the other side of the country, to an RV park in Scotts Valley, California. A man named Gordon Jensen is staying at the Holiday Host RV park, where he also works as a handyman. Jensen befriends a couple staying at the park, Catherine and Richard Decker. The Deckers are staying there temporarily for a few months and strike up a friendship with Jensen. Gordon Jensen confides in the Deckers that he's having trouble taking care of his daughter, Lisa, on his own. The Deckers notice that Lisa looks skinny and unkempt, her clothes are tattered. Jensen tells the Decker that Lisa's mother had died from cancer and his grief is palpable to them. As time goes on, the Deckers begin to think. Their daughter in Southern California has been looking to adopt a girl. Perhaps Lisa would be a good fit. Knowing this information, Gordon Jensen presents the idea to the Deckers of taking Lisa on a trial adoption basis for 2 weeks. The Deckers accept. After some time passes with the Decker family, Lisa begins to show signs of abuse. The Deckers arrive back to the trailer park to contact Gordon Jensen in an effort to make the adoption legal. But when they do, they discover that Gordon Jensen has disappeared, vanished without a trace. Detectives in San Bernardino are contacted to help find the so-called father. They search Jensen's trailers for fingerprints. Most of the surfaces are wiped down clean, but after an extensive search, they do find a fingerprint sample. A search is conducted, and they receive a hit, but not for the name Gordon Jensen. The name is now Curtis Kimball. A year earlier, in 1985, Curtis Kimball was arrested for drunk driving with Lisa in the passenger seat of the car. He was charged with reckless driving and child endangerment. Once he made bail, he immediately fled from the authorities. It seemed that Gordon Jensen, or now Curtis Kimball, had a habit of fleeing from police. 2 years after he disappeared from the RV park, he is arrested once again, this time for driving a stolen vehicle. The name he gives, this time, is Gerald Mockerman. Fingerprint testing would confirm that Gordon Jensen, Curtis Kimball, and Gerald Mockerman are all the same man. And so he is arrested and put in prison on the previous charges of child abandonment under the name Curtis Kimball. He spends a year in prison and is then released on parole in 1990. Instead of following the conditions of his parole, however, Curtis Kimball flees once again. Lisa, his alleged daughter, was taken from the Deckers by the state and put into Child Protective Services. No one at the time realizes it, but the story of Lisa will be the key to solving the Bear Brook murders. It will be almost 10 years until police run into Curtis Kimball once again. 10 years pass, which brings us to the year 2000 in California. Eunsoon Jun, a chemist in her mid-40s, introduces her new boyfriend to her family. His name this time is Larry Vanner. Right away, the meeting does not go well. There's something off about Vanner, and it sends shivers down the spines of Eunsoon's friends and family. He's loud, abrasive, and disrespectful, refusing to answer questions about his past. As months pass, Eunsoon Jun becomes more and more estranged from her friends and family. Eventually, she stops contacting them at all. In 2002, Eunsoon's friend Rose becomes concerned and begins to make phone calls to try and reconnect with her friend. Larry Vanner answers each time, and each time gives a different excuse to why Eunsoon can't come to the phone. Frustrated and worried, Rose gives Vanner an ultimatum. She is leaving on vacation for 10 days, and if she doesn't hear Eunsoon's voice on her answering machine when she arrives back home, she will contact the authorities. And in the end, that's exactly what Rose does. Detective Roxanne Groenfield takes on the case and can't find a trace of Eunsoon, and so she decides to bring in her live-in boyfriend Larry Vanner to the department for questioning. They ask him where Eunsoon Jun is and if she is okay. Vanner avoids the question and doesn't give over any helpful information. Instead, he meanders. At first, he says she's in Oregon taking care of one of his properties. Then he changes his story and says that Eunsoon had a nervous breakdown and is intentionally avoiding contact. The investigators decide to fingerprint Larry Vanner to learn more about him. Vanner agrees. Little does he know that technology has advanced in the past 10 years. It will not take days for the fingerprint results to come back. Instead, it will only take a few minutes. Almost immediately, the prints come back with the criminal record, but the name is not Larry Vanner, it's Curtis Kimball.
All right, Larry, your prints came back. You know your other name, right?
Curtis or Gerald or Jerry or whatever name you're going by this week.
Curtis Kimball.
Curtis Kimball. Or Gerald
Mockerman?
Mockerman, right.
Ring a bell?
No.
Yeah, that's who you are, man.
Immediately, he is placed under arrest, but the mystery still remains. Where is Eunsoon Jun? Their suspect, confronted with his many aliases, declines to make any further comment. And so, detectives arrive at the house where Eunsoon and Kimball lived to conduct a search. They don't see any signs of a struggle or dismay, but can't help but notice the lack of any women's items in the house. It's clear that Eunsoon has not lived there for some time. There are, however, pictures of her on the refrigerator. In the garage, detectives make a startling discovery. In a crawl space at the back of the garage, there is an enormous pile of cat litter, 4 feet in diameter, 4 feet high. An axe leans up against the wall. Blood spatter covers the ceiling and walls. A crime scene investigative team is brought in, and as they begin to brush away the cat litter, they discover a foot poking out. They will find a human body, almost mummified. The body is positively identified as Sun Jun. She had died due to blunt force trauma to the head. Larry Vanner, aka Curtis Kimball, is then charged with the murder of Sun Jun. Surprisingly, he pleads guilty and refuses to answer any more questions from the authorities. It would seem that their murder investigation was solved, but Detective Gronfield, however, is not satisfied. The case begins to haunt her. Who was the little girl Lisa that she had read about in the case file? Was she really this man's daughter? With the question gnawing at her, Detective Grunfield puts in a request to conduct a paternity test. A court order is given to get a blood sample from Larry Vanner, now in prison, and is tested against the sample retrieved from Lisa when she was 5 years old in police custody. There is no match. Larry Vanner, aka Curtis Kimball, aka Gary Jensen, is not Lisa's father. Detective Gronfield contacts the San Bernardino Sheriff's Office, who had handled Lisa's case 17 years earlier. She informs them that Lisa is actually a Jane Doe. She is a missing person, an unidentified victim who is still alive. Shocked, the San Bernardino Police Department opens an investigation to find Lisa's true identity. The year is now 2003. Lisa is now 22 years old. She learns that the man she thought was her father is not. She doesn't know the truth of who her mother is. She doesn't even know her birth name. Who is she? The answer will come, but like in all other aspects of this case, it will take time. 10 years will pass. Then, in 2013, Lisa has an idea. She hears in the news about people using DNA database websites to find long-lost relatives. Thinking this could help her find her true identity, she submits her DNA to Ancestry.com. Investigators also jump on board and contact Dr. Barbara Ray Venter, a genetic genealogist specializing in reuniting adopted individuals with their birth parents. Dr. Ray Venter used the same technique she uses with her adoption clients to try and determine Lisa's identity. She would spend over 10,000 hours working on the case, trying to find out Lisa's name, until one day she finds Lisa's grandfather, a man living in Wisconsin named Armand Bowden. Bowden tells Dr. Venter that he had a daughter, Denise Bowden. This is Lisa's mother. Lisa's birth name is discovered, Dawn Bowden. The last time her grandfather ever saw Lisa and her mother was in 1981. Denise was dating a man named Bob Evans. Soon after they started dating, the three of them disappeared. The Bowden family, however, never filed a missing persons report, assuming that Denise and Dawn had left to make a fresh start. Authorities suspect that Bob Evans is yet another alias for Larry Vanner, aka Curtis Kimball. They show photos of Vanner to Lisa's grandfather, who identifies him as Bob Evans. The year is now 2016, and investigators open a missing persons investigation into Denise Bowden. They discover that she was last seen in Manchester, New Hampshire, which is only 25 minutes away from Bear Brook State Park. Denise Bowden was last seen in 1981. The first barrel was found 4 years later in 1985, and so they begin to wonder, are the two cases related? Could Denise Bowden be the adult victim in the first barrel found at Bear Brook State Park? New Hampshire State Police set their sight on Bob Evans and discover that he had ties to Bear Brook State Park, as he worked at a general store on the campgrounds eerily close to the spot where the barrels were discovered. The bodies of the Bear Brook victims are exhumed for a DNA test. Unfortunately, it's not a match. The adult victim is not, in fact, Denise Bowden. It's a deflating moment for the investigative team. Despite this, Denise Bowden is presumed dead, and authorities believe that Bob Evans, aka Curtis Kimball, aka Larry Vanner, is responsible for her murder. Unfortunately, the whereabouts of Denise Bowden's remains is still a mystery, an open case to this day. The authorities remain determined, however, and decide to test the DNA of Bob Evans against the three remaining victims in the Bear Brook case. What they find out is shocking. The middle child victim was the daughter of Bob Evans. This man, with multiple aliases, is now tied to the Bear Brook victims. Detectives realize they are dealing with a serial killer and still don't even know what his real name is. Dr. Barbara Ray Venter is called upon once again to discover the true identity of Bob Evans. Using the DNA profile, she builds a family tree of the killer and is able to find out his true identity. Bob Evans is actually Terry Rasmussen, a man from Colorado. Finally, they know their killer's true identity. Terry Peter Rasmussen was born on December 23, 1943 in Denver, Colorado. His family then moved to Arizona, where he grew up and attended Northridge High School in Phoenix until he dropped out during his sophomore year in 1960. He then enlisted in the United States Navy in 1961, where he was trained as an electrician. He served for 6 years until he was discharged in 1967. After leaving the Navy, Rasmussen married in 1968 and had 4 children, including a pair of twins in 1969. He lived with his family both in Phoenix, Arizona, and Redwood City, California. Contemporary interviews with Rasmussen's children revealed that he was physically abusive. Reportedly, he burned one of his sons with cigarettes. His wife would leave him in 1975 after he was arrested for aggravated assault. The last time his family would ever see him would be in December of that year. After that, Terry Rasmussen was in the wind. Unfortunately, all of these revelations in the case had come too late for Rasmussen to be brought to justice in the Bear Brook case. Terry Peter Rasmussen had died in prison on December 29, 2010, at the age of 67. His cause of death was a combination of lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and pneumonia. It is very rare in murder investigations for authorities to know the identity of the killer but not their victims, but unfortunately, that was the case for the Bear Brook murders. The question still remained: who were these 4 victims found in the barrel? Where were their families? The answer would come, partially, but again, it would take time. Becky Heath, a research librarian and web sleuth, decided to take the case on in her free time. For years, helping connect people to their missing loved ones had been a hobby of Heath's. Combined with her interest in the Bear Brook case, she got to work trying to find potential matches for the victims. It was now November 2017. She combed through various missing persons message boards where family members would post looking for their lost relatives. She finds a post that seems to match to some of the victims in the Bear Brook case. A woman was trying to find her sister and 2 nieces, who had gone missing decades earlier in 1978. Becky Heath contacts the poster and asks them when they last saw their sister. The poster responds that the last time they saw her was in Thanksgiving 1978, when she had brought in her new boyfriend to meet their family, a man with the last name Rasmussen. At the same time Becky Heath was conducting her search, Barbara Ray Venter continued her investigation. She had read an article about a new forensic technique which was able to retrieve DNA from rootless hair samples. And so, hair samples of the victims were sent to UC Santa Cruz for testing with this new technique. Chromosomal DNA was able to be extracted from the rootless hair, from which Ray Venter was able to make a profile. After decades, 2 parallel investigations were able to reveal the identities of 3 of the 4 victims. Almost like fate, both investigations concluded at the same time. And so, on June 6, 2019, a press conference was held by the New Hampshire State Police. They revealed to the public that they had identified the mother, the oldest child, and the youngest child victims. The adult victim's name was Marlise Honeychurch. The eldest child was Marie Vaugh. The youngest child was Sarah McWaters. At the time Marlise Honeychurch went missing, she had a boyfriend named Terry Rasmussen. The identity of the 4th victim, who was determined to be the biological daughter of Terry Rasmussen, still remains a mystery to this day, but hopefully with the continued efforts of investigators, this mystery will be solved. Marlise's brothers and sisters were contacted. For years they had wondered what happened to their sister. For years they had searched for her and came up empty. Now, finally, Marlise and her daughters could be laid to rest. Honeychurch and Vaughn's funerals were held in November 2019 in Allenstown, during which they were given a new headstone bearing their names. In attendance were members of Honeychurch's family and Rasmussen's daughter from his first marriage. Sarah was laid to rest in Connecticut. closer to her father's family. After 3 decades, they were finally laid to rest with their true identities now intact. This case is a terrifying profile of a killer operating in the shadows for years, and while it may not have a satisfying conclusion, it was the first case in history solved by genetic genealogy. This same technique would be used in 2018 to identify the notorious Golden State Killer, a serial killer cold case from California. Genetic genealogy is now being used across the globe to solve similar cold cases. The butterfly effect of the Bear Brook investigation is profound. Hopefully, in the coming months and years, the 4th victim's identity will be revealed, and the Bear Brook case can finally be closed. Until then, all we can do is wait. Thank you for watching today's video. If you have any suggestions for cases, please leave them in the comments. And thank you for riding the crime wave with me. Until next week, take care.